Billionaire's mom has a problem with Poor Waitress. Emma Mitchell woke to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand beside her bed. She didn't need to look at the screen. She already knew who was calling. The hospital billing department had become a regular presence in her life, their calls as predictable as sunrise and twice as unwelcome. She silenced the phone and lay in the darkness of her tiny bedroom, listening to the sounds of the city beyond her window. Sirens wailed in the distance. A car horn blared. Somewhere above her apartment, someone was playing music too loudly. This was the soundtrack of her life, the constant noise of millions of people living on top of each other in a city that never slept and never showed mercy to people like her. The apartment was small, barely large enough for the two of them. The bedroom where Emma slept was barely 8 feet wide. The living room, where her brother's hospital bed took up most of the space, smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else. Something like stale hope and slow death. Emma pulled herself out of bed reluctantly. She was 26 years old, but her body felt ancient. Every muscle ached from the double shift she'd been working. Her hands were rough from washing dishes and scrubbing floors. Her back was curved from years of bending over tables, clearing plates, making herself smaller so as not to take up space that belonged to people richer and more important than her. She padded quietly to the living room, careful not to wake Daniel. But when she got there, she found him already awake, staring at the ceiling with that expression she'd learned to recognize, the look of someone who'd spent the night in pain and given up hope that tomorrow would be different. Daniel Mitchell was 19 years old. 5 years ago, he'd been a typical teenager, loud, energetic, full of dreams about college and football and a future that stretched out in front of him like an open road. 5 years ago, a drunk driver had crossed the center line of a highway and erased that future in the space of a second. The impact had broken his spine in 2 places. The doctors said he was lucky. Lucky to be alive. Lucky to still have feeling in his legs, even if he couldn't move them. Lucky to have survived something that had killed 3 other people in the other car. Emma didn't feel lucky, and from the expression on Daniel's face, neither did he. "Morning," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from disuse. Daniel didn't talk much anymore. What was the point? Words didn't change anything. "Morning," Emma replied, forcing brightness into her voice. "How did you sleep?" Daniel didn't answer. They both knew he hadn't slept. His eyes were too red, his expression too tired. She sat on the edge of his hospital bed, the same bed that had been in their living room for 5 years, the bed that had become a permanent fixture, a reminder of everything that had been lost. She took his hand. His skin was warm, but his grip was weak. Everything about him was weak now, was diminished, was a shadow of what he used to be. The hospital called again, 3 times, while you were sleeping. Emma's stomach dropped. What did they say? That they're dropping my coverage. Physical therapy is no longer approved. The insurance company says I've reached my maximum benefit threshold. After this month, there's nothing else they'll pay for. My rehab ends next month. After that, I'm on my own. The words hung in the darkness between them, like a death sentence. Physical therapy was the only thing keeping Daniel's muscles from completely atrophying. It was the only hope they had that he might regain some mobility, some independence, some semblance of the life he had before the accident took everything from him. Emma felt her chest tighten. Money. It always came down to money. They didn't have any. The medical bills had long ago exceeded what their mother's life insurance had paid out. The settlement from the lawsuit against the drunk driver had been swallowed by legal fees and hospital bills. They were drowning, slowly, inexorably, in a debt that grew with every passing month. "We'll figure it out," Emma said. But her voice wavered. They both knew that was a lie. There was no figuring it out. There was only finding new ways to survive in an increasingly impossible situation. "How?" Daniel asked. His question wasn't accusatory, just tired, like he had already accepted the answer and was just confirming what they both already knew.
You're already working 70 hours a week. You're picking up every available shift. You've worked Christmas, New Year's, your birthday. What else can you do? What else can either of us do?" Emma didn't have an answer. There were no easy solutions, no hidden savings, no family to call for help. Their mother was gone. Their father had disappeared years ago when Daniel was just a baby. There was no one but the two of them, drowning slowly in medical bills and insurance denials and a financial system that seemed designed to break people like them. She stood and kissed her forehead, avoiding the conversation that had become a daily ritual. The one where they both acknowledged how close they were to losing everything, how fragile their situation was, how one more unexpected bill could bring the whole house of cards crashing down. "I have a double shift tonight. 9 to midnight, then back at 6. Friday nights are busy. The tips should be good. Maybe we'll catch a break." Daniel didn't respond. They both knew the tips wouldn't be good enough. They never were. Emma showered in the tiny bathroom, standing under the spray of lukewarm water and trying to gather her energy for the shift ahead. She needed to be invisible tonight. That was her superpower. Being present but not noticed, essential but forgotten. People tipped better when they didn't have to think about the person serving them. She changed into her uniform in front of the mirror. Black dress, white apron, black shoes. The dress was from 3 years ago and had been resold twice. The apron had a small stain near the pocket that wouldn't come out no matter how hard she scrubbed. She pulled her blonde hair back so tightly it hurt, the pain a welcome distraction from everything else. In the mirror, she saw her mother's face superimposed over her own. Sarah Mitchell's green eyes, though Emma's were duller now, dimmed by years of exhaustion. Sarah's determined chin, though Emma's had sharpened from not eating enough. Sarah's expression of quiet desperation, the look of someone who'd learned that life didn't always turn out the way you planned. Their mother had died 5 years ago, in the same accident that had taken Daniel's mobility. She'd been distracted, arguing with Emma about something stupid. Emma couldn't even remember what now, and she had run a red light. Another car had hit her broadside. Sarah was dead before the ambulance arrived. Daniel was thrown from the car and landed in the street, his spine snapping under the impact. And Emma? Emma was the lucky one. She'd been in the passenger seat, with the airbag. She'd walked away with barely a scratch. The guilt of that survival had never left her.
She applied her makeup mechanically, concealer under the eyes to hide the sleepless nights, blush to suggest health she didn't possess. The illusion was important. Customers at Les Ciel de Rey wanted their servers to look like they'd stepped out of a magazine, not like they were one medical bill away from homelessness. By 8:30, Emma was on the subway heading downtown. The train was packed with Friday night revelers, people with money and plans and futures. She stood wedged between a woman in a designer dress and a man checking his phone every 2 seconds. She made herself small, invisible, the way she'd learned to do. Les Ciel de Rey occupied the 40th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. The restaurant's windows overlooked the city like it owned it, like the thousands of people below were just decorations in someone else's world. By the time Emma arrived for her shift, the sun had set, and the city had transformed into something glittering and cold. The staff bathroom was crowded with servers preparing for their shifts. Emma changed her shoes, clipped her name tag to her apron, and joined the pre-shift meeting where Marcus, the head waiter, went over the specials and reminded everyone to smile and make eye contact and treat every customer like they were the most important person in the world. Marcus had been the head waiter at Les Ciel de Rey for 12 years. He'd seen servers come and go, but he'd kept Emma on through 5 years of mediocre performance reviews and the subtle ways the wealthy expressed their indifference to her existence. He was kind in his way, and Emma suspected he understood what her life was really like, but kindness didn't pay the bills. The restaurant was packed by 9 o'clock. Every table was full, every server was running.
The kitchen was a blur of movement and heat and the constant barking of orders. Emma fell into the rhythm of it. Take order, deliver food, clear plates, refill water, ask if everything was okay, smile and nod and make yourself useful without being intrusive. She was clearing plates from table 6 when Marcus appeared at her elbow, his expression urgent in a way that made her stomach immediately tighten. "Table 1 just arrived. Whitmore party. You'll be serving them." Emma felt her entire body go rigid. Whitmore. The name alone meant something in New York's social circles. Power, old money, the kind of wealth that had been accumulating for generations. And with that wealth came a particular kind of cruelty, the casual dismissal of anyone deemed beneath their station. "I'll be careful," Emma said, which was what you said when you knew you were about to navigate a minefield and you wanted to convince yourself you could do it without stepping on anything explosive. She approached table 1 with her notepad ready, her eyes cast downward in a posture of deference that had become as natural as breathing. She'd learned over 5 years that looking up was dangerous. Looking up meant being seen, and being seen meant being vulnerable to judgment. But when she looked up to take their order, she froze completely. The woman at the table was impossible to miss. Victoria Whitmore, 68 years old, commanded space the way empires commanded territories. Her silver hair was styled in an elaborate updo that must have taken 2 hours at some exclusive salon. Diamonds hung from her ears and throat and adorned nearly every finger. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than Emma made in a month, probably cost more than Emma made in 6 months. She looked at the world with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never been denied anything in her entire life, who'd never had to question whether she belonged in any space she chose to occupy. And beside her, a man in an immaculate white thobe and gutra. The fabric of his traditional dress was pristine white, offset by a dark gutra held in place with a golden agal studded with small jewels. He wore it with the ease of someone for whom formal dress was a way of life, not a costume. His bearing was elegant but haunted, like he was physically present but emotionally somewhere else. Alexander Whitmore. Emma recognized him from society pages that Daniel sometimes scrolled through on his laptop, a billionaire real estate magnate who'd inherited an empire from his father and expanded it into something almost unimaginable. His name appeared regularly in the business section of the Times. His photo showed up occasionally in gossip columns, always with the caption, "Manhattan's most eligible bachelor since wife's death." More importantly, Emma recognized the sadness in his eyes. She'd seen that same deadness in her own mirror every morning for 5 years, the look of someone who'd survived something they weren't sure was worth surviving. Victoria's voice cut through the restaurant like a blade, sharp and cutting and designed to establish dominance through sheer force of personality. Everyone within earshot immediately fell silent. "These tables are far too close together," she announced to Marcus, gesturing dismissively at the perfectly spaced dining tables. "My son and I require privacy. Reseat us immediately." "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus said quickly, his entire demeanor shifting into a kind of anxious obsequiousness. "Right away, I'll have our best table prepared for you." But Victoria's eyes landed on Emma, and they moved from her face to her clothing, assessing with visible disdain. Emma felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing, cataloging her flaws, the dress that wasn't expensive enough, the shoes that had been resoled twice, the hair that was blonde but not the right kind of blonde, the posture that suggested someone who'd been taught to take up as little space as possible. "Who is that server?" Victoria asked, not bothering to lower her voice. Discretion was for people who were afraid of being judged. Victoria Whitmore had no such fears. "That's Emma, one of our excellent servers," Marcus started, attempting to preemptively defend his employee. "I don't care about her credentials," Victoria interrupted, her voice carrying the certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I care that she's dressed inappropriately. That dress is rumpled. She looks like she's wearing a dead woman's clothes." The comment landed like a physical blow to Emma's chest. She felt her face flush immediately, felt the color rising up her neck like a stain. Around her, other servers suddenly found urgent tasks elsewhere, avoiding the collision between power and powerlessness that was unfolding. "The dress is fine," Alexander said quietly. It was a small statement, barely more than a whisper, so quiet that Emma almost didn't hear it. But something in his tone made Victoria's spine stiffen immediately. Victoria turned to her son, her eyes narrowing with the fury of someone being contradicted. "Excuse me?" "I said the dress is fine," Alexander repeated, his voice measured but with an edge underneath that suggested he was someone who could be dangerous when provoked. "Are you seriously defending the staff to me? I'm trying to ensure you're being served with appropriate standards."
"The only standards being violated are your own," Alexander said, and there was something cold in his tone that made Victoria's jaw clench. This was a man who had his own power, Emma realized. This was a man who could stand up to Victoria Whitmore and not wilt under the force of her personality. Victoria stood abruptly, her movements sharp with barely contained fury. "I'm going to speak to the manager about this restaurant's hiring practices." She swept away from the table, her movements jerky with anger, leaving Alexander alone with the weight of the moment settling over him. For just a second, maybe less, his eyes met Emma's. In that moment, something passed between them, a flicker of recognition, of shared understanding. He knew what it felt like to be diminished by Victoria Whitmore. He knew what it felt like to have your humanity questioned by someone who saw you as beneath them. Emma felt her hands trembling as she moved through the rest of her shift. She was hyper-aware of every movement, every potential mistake. But Alexander was no longer in her section. Another server, someone more experienced and less likely to anger the Whitmores, had been reassigned to table 1. Emma tried to focus on her other tables, but her mind kept returning to that moment when Alexander had defended her. No one ever did that. No one ever stood up to the wealthy on behalf of people like her. It was a kindness so unexpected that it destabilized her, made her question whether she'd imagined it. It was near the end of her shift, around 11 o'clock, when everything changed. Emma was carefully balancing a tray of cocktails, 3 martinis, 1 margarita, a glass of red wine, near table 1, when Victoria returned to the table. She'd clearly called the manager and won some kind of victory because her expression was triumphant. Her shoulders were back, her chin was raised. She was gesturing dramatically, explaining something to Alexander, using her hands to command space around her. Emma approached carefully, reading the energy at the table. Victoria was wound up, adrenaline still coursing through her from her confrontation with Alexander. She was restless, agitated, not fully present in her body. Emma knew the signs. She'd learned to read people through years of serving them, understanding their moods and their needs and their capacity to hurt. As Emma moved past, Victoria suddenly stood, turning to leave the table. Her arm caught the edge of Emma's tray with the force of movement. The physics of it were almost inevitable. Tray going one direction, woman's arm going another. The moment of contact creating an explosion of liquid and glass. 3 martinis, 1 margarita, and a glass of red wine splattered across the pristine white tablecloth, soaking into the expensive fabric and directly onto Alexander's expensive trousers. The glasses shattered on the floor, sending shards across the marble in a scatter that seemed to echo throughout the entire restaurant. The restaurant froze. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Even the ambient music seemed to pause in acknowledgement of the disaster that had just unfolded. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward table 1, watching the spectacle unfold. "Oh my God," Emma whispered, her entire body shaking. Her voice came out so small that barely anyone heard it. "I'm so sorry. I'm so—" "Don't touch him," Victoria said, sharply, stepping between Emma and Alexander. Her voice was ice and venom, perfectly calculated to cause maximum damage. "You've done quite enough damage." Emma's face burned. She could feel the judgment of every diner in the restaurant. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing her, finding her lacking. This was what happened when you tried to work in spaces where you didn't belong. This was the price of necessity. This was the way the world reminded you of your place. "It was an accident," Alexander said, standing and brushing liquid from his pants with movements that were remarkably composed for someone who'd been drenched in cocktails. "No harm done." "No harm?" Victoria's voice dripped with contempt. She looked directly at Emma, and the coldness in her eyes was absolute. It was the look of someone who didn't see another human being, but rather a problem to be solved. "Mother," Alexander said, his tone suddenly hard. There was a warning in his voice, a line being drawn. But Victoria wasn't finished. She was warming up now, her voice rising, clearly enjoying the power of the moment. She turned to Marcus, who had rushed over with towels and the desperate expression of someone watching their job security evaporate. "I want her fired," Victoria announced, her voice loud enough that the entire restaurant could hear. "Tonight, I'm calling the owner. I'm calling my lawyer. This incompetence is exactly why Manhattan's service standards have declined. This establishment has become a haven for mediocrity. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sure this was just—" "I don't care what it was." Victoria cut him off, her voice sharp as a knife. "I want her gone, or I'll ensure this restaurant loses every important client I know. And believe me, that's a significant percentage of your revenue. I can destroy this place with one phone call." It wasn't an empty threat. Everyone in the restaurant understood that. Victoria Whitmore had the power to make good on that promise. She had the connections, the wealth, the social standing to systematically eliminate Les Ciels Dorés' client base until the restaurant was forced to close. Emma felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, that sickening sensation of free fall. She'd worked here for 5 years, 5 years of showing up for double shifts, 5 years of perfect service, of invisibility, of doing everything right. And one spilled drink, one accident caused by Victoria herself, might cost her the only job keeping her and Daniel alive. Alexander's face darkened. He stood and turned to his mother, his voice low but carrying the weight of real anger. "This is completely unreasonable. It was clearly an accident. You practically caused it yourself. You stood up directly into her path." "I don't care," Victoria said coldly. She was enjoying this, Emma realized. She was enjoying the chaos she was creating. She gestured for the host to reseat them at a different table, away from Emma's section. As she walked away, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She'd already won. Alexander hesitated for just a moment, his eyes finding Emma's one last time. In that moment, she saw his apology, his frustration, his own helplessness against the force that was his mother. And then he followed her, and Emma was left standing alone, holding the remnants of destroyed glasses, feeling her entire world collapsing around her. Emma stood alone in the middle of the dining room for what felt like an eternity, but was probably just 30 seconds. Around her, diners returned to their meals, but with lowered voices, aware that they'd witnessed something beyond the normal restaurant drama. They'd witnessed a display of power, raw and unfiltered. They'd watched someone be publicly humiliated by someone with enough wealth and influence to justify it.
She moved mechanically through the rest of her shift. She cleaned the table. She served her remaining customers. She moved through the motions of her job while feeling like a ghost watching her own life end. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was racing. Her mind was spinning with the implications of what had just happened. By the time her shift ended at midnight, Marcus had already spoken to Bernard, the restaurant's owner. By the time Emma changed out of her uniform and stepped into the cold March night, the decision had been made. By the time she reached her apartment, her 5 years of employment were being dissolved. She walked home in the rain, letting it soak through her thin jacket. The sky was dark and heavy, matching her mood. She thought about Daniel, waiting at home, depending on her. She thought about the medical bills that were piling up. She thought about the apartment rent that was due in 2 weeks. She thought about how fragile everything was, how quickly it could all fall apart.
When she reached her apartment, Daniel was still awake, watching the door with worried eyes. "How was your shift?" he asked. Emma stood in the doorway, dripping rainwater onto the floor, and couldn't find the words to explain. "How do you tell someone who's already lost everything that you've just lost the one thing holding you both afloat?" "I had a rough night," she finally said, which was a massive understatement. She didn't tell him about Victoria Whitmore. She didn't tell him about the spilled drinks. She didn't tell him that she was probably going to be fired. She just kissed his forehead and told him to get some sleep. But she didn't sleep. She sat on the couch in the darkness of their apartment and stared at her phone, waiting for the call that she knew was coming. It came Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Marcus called her, and his voice was pained, apologetic but final. "Emma," he said, and she could hear the resignation in his tone. "I'm so sorry. Bernard and I have discussed this extensively over the weekend. We have to let you go." "What?" Emma sat up in bed, her heart suddenly racing. She'd known it was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a punch to the gut. "Marcus, you know me. You know I didn't do anything wrong. The security footage." "The security footage shows that Mrs. Whitmore caused the spill," Marcus said quickly, attempting to soften the blow with facts. "That's not the issue. The issue is liability. Mrs. Whitmore has threatened to sue the restaurant if we don't terminate you. She's threatening to pull her entire social circle. She's threatening to call the health department and claim she found unsanitary conditions." "We can't defend against those kinds of threats, Emma. Bernard has made the decision. Your termination is effective immediately." Emma felt something inside her break, not dramatically, not with any grand gesture. It just cracked, like glass under pressure, and she felt pieces of her falling into a darkness below. "Marcus, please," she started, but he was already continuing. "I'll have your final check mailed to you. And Emma, I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. You were a good employee." The line went dead. Emma sat in bed for a long time after that, the phone still pressed to her ear, unable to move. 5 years. 5 years of showing up. 5 years of perfect service. 5 years of being invisible and reliable and everything a restaurant could want. Gone. Erased. Destroyed in a single moment because of a woman she'd never met before Friday night. She thought about calling back, demanding to speak to Bernard directly. She thought about threatening to sue for wrongful termination, but she knew it would be pointless. Victoria Whitmore had more money than Emma would ever see in her entire life. Victoria Whitmore had lawyers and connections and the kind of power that made people like Emma disappear with barely a trace. Daniel was still asleep when she went to wake him. She didn't want to tell him. She wanted to protect him from this, from the weight of another catastrophe, but she couldn't lie to him. They'd made a pact years ago to always be honest with each other, no matter how bad things got. "I had the restaurant fired me," she said simply, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Oh, Em, why? What happened?" She told him everything. About Victoria Whitmore, about the spilled drinks, about the humiliation, about the threat, about waking up this morning to find herself unemployed. "That's not fair," Daniel said, and hearing the anger in his voice was somehow worse than if he'd cried. "That's not fair at all." "No, it's not. But the world isn't fair, Daniel. We both learned that 5 years ago." She spent the day making phone calls. 37 restaurants. Not one would hire someone with a termination from Lucille Duray when Victoria Whitmore was connected to that termination. Every hiring manager suddenly had positions that were already filled. Every restaurant mysteriously had their hiring frozen. Word traveled fast in the restaurant industry. Emma discovered that within hours of her firing, rumors had spread. She was incompetent, she was clumsy, she was unreliable. She'd been fired from the most prestigious restaurant in Manhattan. In a competitive market where reputation was everything, that was a death sentence. By Tuesday evening, Emma had applied for 42 jobs and received 0 callbacks. By Wednesday, she'd started looking at temporary agencies. The positions available were soul-crushing: overnight cleaning crews for office buildings, telemarketing, data entry, and basement offices with flickering fluorescent lights and the slow death of meaningless work. By Thursday, she'd found one position available that seemed almost respectable: home care companion. The pay was minimal, the hours were unpredictable, but it was something that didn't require Lucille Duray as a reference. It was a lifeline, and Emma grabbed it.
She called the number listed in the ad, her hand shaking slightly as she dialed. Whitmore Residence? A professional voice answered. How may I help you? Emma's stomach clenched so hard she almost hung up. Whitmore. Of all the names in Manhattan, of all the families, it had to be Whitmore. But she needed this job too badly. She couldn't let her pride or her fear get in the way of survival. I'm calling about the home care position? The companion role? Yes, we're seeking someone to provide care for an elderly woman. Reading, conversation, light household tasks. Are you interested? I am. Can I schedule an interview? The interview was scheduled for Friday afternoon at an Upper East Side address. Emma dressed carefully in her nicest outfit, a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, and took the subway uptown with her heart pounding and her hands shaking. The building was impressive in ways Emma had never experienced. The doorman was dressed in a uniform that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The lobby was marble and crystal, and the kind of opulence that made her feel immediately out of place, like she was contaminating something precious just by walking through it. A private elevator lifted her 40 floors. The higher she went, the more anxious she became. What if this was some kind of trap? What if Victoria had somehow orchestrated this? What if this was just another way for her to be humiliated? She moved mechanically through the rest of her shift. She cleaned the table. She served her remaining customers. She moved through the motions of her job while feeling like a ghost watching her own life end. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was racing. Her mind was spinning with the implications of what had just happened. By the time her shift ended at midnight, Marcus had already spoken to Bernard, the restaurant's owner. By the time Emma changed out of her uniform and stepped into the cold March night, the decision had been made. By the time she reached her apartment, her 5 years of employment were being dissolved. She walked home in the rain, letting it soak through her thin jacket. The sky was dark and heavy, matching her mood. She thought about Daniel, waiting at home, depending on her. She thought about the medical bills that were piling up. She thought about the apartment rent that was due in 2 weeks. She thought about how fragile everything was, how quickly it could all fall apart. When she reached her apartment, Daniel was still awake, watching the door with worried eyes. "How was your shift?" he asked. Emma stood in the doorway, dripping rainwater onto the floor, and couldn't find the words to explain. How do you tell someone who's already lost everything that you've just lost the one thing holding you both afloat? "I had a rough night," she finally said, which was a massive understatement. She didn't tell him about Victoria Whitmore. She didn't tell him about the spilled drinks. She didn't tell him that she was probably going to be fired. She just kissed his forehead and told him to get some sleep. But she didn't sleep. She sat on the couch in the darkness of their apartment and stared at her phone, waiting for the call that she knew was coming. It came Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Marcus called her, and his voice was pained, apologetic but final. "Emma," he said, and she could hear the resignation in his tone. "I'm so sorry. Bernard and I have discussed this extensively over the weekend. We have to let you go." "What?" Emma sat up in bed, her heart suddenly racing. She'd known it was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a punch to the gut. "Marcus, you know me. You know I didn't do anything wrong. The security footage." "The security footage shows that Mrs. Whitmore caused the spill," Marcus said quickly, attempting to soften the blow with facts. "That's not the issue. The issue is liability. Mrs. Whitmore has threatened to sue the restaurant if we don't terminate you. She's threatening to pull her entire social circle. She's threatening to call the health department and claim she found unsanitary conditions." "We can't defend against those kinds of threats, Emma. Bernard has made the decision. Your termination is effective immediately." Emma felt something inside her break, not dramatically, not with any grand gesture. It just cracked, like glass under pressure, and she felt pieces of her falling into a darkness below. "Marcus, please," she started, but he was already continuing. "I'll have your final check mailed to you. And Emma, I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. You were a good employee." The line went dead. Emma sat in bed for a long time after that, the phone still pressed to her ear, unable to move. 5 years. 5 years of showing up. 5 years of perfect service. 5 years of being invisible and reliable and everything a restaurant could want. Gone. Erased. Destroyed in a single moment because of a woman she'd never met before Friday night. She thought about calling back, demanding to speak to Bernard directly. She thought about threatening to sue for wrongful termination, but she knew it would be pointless. Victoria Whitmore had more money than Emma would ever see in her entire life. Victoria Whitmore had lawyers and connections and the kind of power that made people like Emma disappear with barely a trace. Daniel was still asleep when she went to wake him. She didn't want to tell him. She wanted to protect him from this, from the weight of another catastrophe, but she couldn't lie to him. They'd made a pact years ago to always be honest with each other, no matter how bad things got. "I had the restaurant fired me," she said simply, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Oh, Em, why? What happened?" She told him everything. About Victoria Whitmore, about the spilled drinks, about the humiliation, about the threat, about waking up this morning to find herself unemployed. "That's not fair," Daniel said, and hearing the anger in his voice was somehow worse than if he'd cried. "That's not fair at all." "No, it's not. But the world isn't fair, Daniel. We both learned that 5 years ago." She spent the day making phone calls. 37 restaurants. Not one would hire someone with a termination from Lucille DeRay when Victoria Whitmore was connected to that termination. Every hiring manager suddenly had positions that were already filled. Every restaurant mysteriously had their hiring frozen. Word traveled fast in the restaurant industry. Emma discovered that within hours of her firing, rumors had spread. She was incompetent, she was clumsy, she was unreliable. She'd been fired from the most prestigious restaurant in Manhattan. In a competitive market where reputation was everything, that was a death sentence. By Tuesday evening, Emma had applied for 42 jobs and received 0 callbacks. By Wednesday, she'd started looking at temporary agencies. The positions available were soul-crushing: overnight cleaning crews for office buildings, telemarketing, data entry, and basement offices with flickering fluorescent lights and the slow death of meaningless work. By Thursday, she'd found one position available that seemed almost respectable: home care companion. The pay was minimal, the hours were unpredictable, but it was something that didn't require Lucille DeRay as a reference. It was a lifeline, and Emma grabbed it. She called the number listed in the ad, her hands shaking slightly as she dialed. "Wetmore Residence?" A professional voice answered. "How may I help you?" Emma's stomach clenched so hard she almost hung up. Whitmore. Of all the names in Manhattan, of all the families, it had to be Whitmore. But she needed this job too badly. She couldn't let her pride or her fear get in the way of survival. "I'm calling about the home care position? The companion role?" "Yes, we're seeking someone to provide care for an elderly woman. Reading, conversation, light household tasks. Are you interested?" "I am. Can I schedule an interview?" The interview was scheduled for Friday afternoon at an Upper East Side address. Emma dressed carefully in her nicest outfit, a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, and took the subway uptown with her heart pounding and her hands shaking. The building was impressive in ways Emma had never experienced. The doorman was dressed in a uniform that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The lobby was marble and crystal, and the kind of opulence that made her feel immediately out of place, like she was contaminating something precious just by walking through it. A private elevator lifted her 40 floors. The higher she went, the more anxious she became. What if this was some kind of trap? What if Victoria had somehow orchestrated this? What if this was just another way for her to be humiliated?
But when the elevator doors opened, Emma found herself in a hallway that was quiet and peaceful, decorated with art that probably belonged in museums, and furniture that had probably been designed by people whose names Emma would recognize if she had the kind of education that taught you those things. A nurse showed her to a bright bedroom overlooking Central Park. In a chair by the window sat an elderly woman with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that looked startlingly familiar. Her face had the bone structure of someone who'd been beautiful once, who'd aged into elegance rather than deterioration. "Mrs. Whitmore will see you now," the nurse said, then withdrew, closing the door behind her. Emma froze completely. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. This woman was connected to Victoria. She had to be. The last name was the same. The apartment was the same address. This was a trap. "Not Victoria," a warm voice said, as if reading her thoughts. I'm Margaret Whitmore, Alexander's grandmother, and I've been hoping you'd answer my ad." Emma's breath caught. Alexander's grandmother, the billionaire's grandmother, the woman who'd placed an ad that somehow had led Emma directly here. "I don't understand," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please sit," Margaret said, gesturing to a chair beside her. "I promise I'm not going to hurt you." Emma sat, but remained tense, perched on the edge of the chair like she might need to flee at any moment. Her mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening, trying to figure out if this was a coincidence or if something larger was at work. Margaret Whitmore had been watching. She had resources that Emma couldn't imagine. She had spent the past week observing her grandson's behavior, seeing how he'd transformed after meeting Emma. She'd noticed how he'd tried repeatedly to contact Emma, only to discover that his mother had blocked her number on his phone without his knowledge. She'd hired private investigators. She'd learned about the firing from Le Ciel Doré. She'd discovered Victoria's threats and her manipulation. And she'd decided that it was time to do something she should have done years ago. Stand up to Victoria Whitmore and prevent her from destroying yet another person who threatened her control over Alexander. "I know what happened," Margaret said quietly. "I know about Victoria. I know about the restaurant. I know about the accusation that's coming." Emma's entire body went rigid. "What accusation?" "The theft accusation," Margaret said, factually. "Victoria's going to claim that you stole a diamond bracelet from her apartment. She's going to file a police report. She has already arranged for a witness, a member of her household staff, to lie and say you saw you take it." "How you know that?" Emma whispered, unable to comprehend how anyone could know something that hadn't even happened yet. "Because I've been collecting evidence on Victoria for the past 40 years, Margaret said. Her voice was calm, factual, like she was discussing the weather. "I've watched her destroy my daughter-in-law. I've watched her manipulate my grandson. I've watched her ruin countless people who dared to get close to him. And I've finally decided that before I die, I'm going to stop her." "Why would you help me?" Emma asked. "I'm nothing. I'm a stranger. I'm someone who spilled drinks on your grandson." "You're not a stranger," Margaret said. She leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes studying Emma's face with an intensity that made Emma want to look away. "You're the first person in 5 years who's made my grandson feel alive. I can see it in his eyes when he talks about you. I can hear it in his voice. For 5 years, Alexander has been half dead, going through the motions of living while his soul stayed frozen in that moment when Catherine died. And then he heard your voice, and something in him woke up." Emma felt tears forming, but she forced them back. "He's going to hate me," Emma said. "When he finds out I took this job because I needed the money, when he realizes I'm here because I was fired and desperate, he's going to think I'm only interested in him for his money." "He might," Margaret agreed, "but he'll respect the truth more than he'd respect a lie. And trust me, dear, that young man has had enough lies in his life. His mother has been lying to him for 40 years. Over the next 30 minutes, Margaret laid out the plan with the precision of someone who'd been thinking about it for a long time. Emma would take the job as her companion. She would spend her days with Margaret, reading, talking, keeping her company. In exchange, Margaret would pay her enough to cover her apartment and Daniel's medical bills, $50,000 a year, which seemed like an impossible fortune to Emma. And Margaret would use this time to gather the evidence needed to prove that any theft accusation was fabricated. "There's one condition," Margaret said, as Emma was preparing to leave, her mind reeling from the unexpected turn of events. "You need to tell Alexander the truth.
about the job, about why you're here, about Victoria's accusation. You need to tell him before Victoria does." "He's going to hate me," Emma said. "He might," Margaret agreed, "but he'll hate you far less for being honest now than he'll hate you for keeping secrets later. Trust me on this. That boy has had enough lies in his life. His mother has been lying to him for 40 years. Emma left Margaret's apartment in a daze. She walked the streets of the Upper East Side for an hour, her mind spinning. She'd expected nothing, and now she had been offered everything: a job, financial security, protection against Victoria's accusation. But more importantly, she'd been offered hope. Emma spent her first week working for Margaret in a fog. She read poetry, Neruda's verses about love and loss, Dickinson's meditations on death, Maya Angelou's celebrations of resilience. She listened to stories about Alexander's childhood, about his father's sudden death from a heart attack when Alexander was only 25, about how Victoria had used grief as a weapon to keep Alexander dependent on her. She convinced him that he needed her, Margaret explained one afternoon as Emma was reading to her. They sat in Margaret's bedroom, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, the city spread out below them like a world that existed beyond their comprehension. She made herself indispensable through manipulation. "How did he meet Catherine?" Emma asked, turning a page in the book that she wasn't really reading. "At a charity gala," Margaret said, a small smile touching her lips. "She was working there as an event coordinator. She was kind and independent, and she saw through Victoria's games immediately. She told Alexander he didn't need his mother's approval to live his life, that he was capable of making his own decisions, that he could love Catherine without needing Victoria's permission. Victoria hated her on sight." "What happened to Catherine?" Emma asked, although she already knew the answer. "She died," Margaret said simply, "in a car accident. She was leaving Alexander because Victoria's manipulation had made their marriage impossible. But before she could finalize the divorce, there was an accident, a drunk driver, and Catherine was dead before the ambulance arrived." Margaret paused, letting the weight of that loss settle over them. "And Alexander?" Emma asked softly. "Alexander blamed himself," Margaret said. "He believed that if he'd been stronger, if he'd stood up to Victoria earlier, Catherine would still be alive. Victoria, of course, used his guilt to further control him. She told him that isolation was protection, that his grief was justified, and that she was the only one who could help him through it." On Thursday afternoon, Margaret casually mentioned that Alexander would be visiting. "He comes every Thursday," Margaret said, as Emma was preparing to leave for the day. "Around 3 o'clock. He takes the afternoon off work, comes here, we have tea. He tells me about his week. I thought you should know." Emma's heart rate immediately accelerated. She thought about leaving early, about avoiding the apartment, but something made her stay. She heard his voice in the other room around 3 o'clock, warm and genuinely loving as he greeted his grandmother. "Hi, Gran, how is your week? Are you feeling okay?" And then Margaret called out, "Alexander, dear, come meet my new companion." Emma stood as he entered the bedroom, and for a moment neither of them moved. Time seemed to stop. They were separated by 15 feet of space, but it might as well have been miles. And then Alexander's face transformed with shock, and then joy, and then confusion. He crossed the room quickly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Emma," he said, the word carrying weight and wonder, "what are you doing here?" "I'm working for your grandmother, as a home care companion."
Alexander looked at Margaret, who was watching them with an expression of satisfied mischief. "You hired her," he said. It wasn't a question. He understood immediately that this wasn't coincidence. "I did," Margaret confirmed, not bothering to hide her smile. "Emma needed a job. I needed a companion. It seemed practical." Alexander took Emma's hands. His touch was warm, his grip gentle but desperate, like he was afraid she might disappear. "Emma, listen to me. I know you lost your job. I know my mother threatened you. I know she's filing accusations against you. I've hired investigators. We're going to prove that she's lying." "I know," Emma said. "Your grandmother told me. Alexander, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." She told him everything. About the past week, about the job rejections, about the fear, about the crushing weight of Victoria's power and how easily it had destroyed everything Emma had built. She told him about the interview with Margaret. She told him about the agreement between them. "It's not your fault," Alexander said fiercely, even as she was explaining. "This is my mother's doing. This is her trying to isolate you, to destroy you before you can—" He stopped himself, but Emma finished the sentence. "Before I can distract you from her. That's what this is about, isn't it? Victoria is terrified of losing control over you." "Yes," Alexander said, his jaw tight. "She's done this before, with Catherine. Catherine was kind and independent, and she threatened Victoria's grip on me. So Victoria made her life miserable. She undermined her constantly. She criticized her appearance, her job, her education, everything. And eventually Catherine couldn't take it anymore. She left me. She was going to file for divorce." "Oh, Alexander," Emma said softly. "But she didn't," Alexander continued. His voice was tight with emotion. "I begged her to come back. I told her I'd cut Victoria out completely. Catherine agreed to try one more time, and 3 days later she died in that accident." "Oh, Alexander," Emma said softly. "I've spent 5 years wondering if Victoria would have driven her away again," Alexander said. His words came faster now, tumbling out like water breaking through a dam. "I've spent 5 years wondering if Catherine would still be alive if I'd been stronger, if I'd protected her better. You couldn't have protected her from a reckless driver, and your mother couldn't have prevented an accident she didn't know was coming." "No," Alexander said, "but she spent the past 5 years trying to make sure it never happens again by keeping me completely isolated and under her control. And now you're threatening that control, and she's going to come after you with everything she has." "I know," Emma said, "but I'm not going to disappear. I'm not going to run." Alexander pulled Emma into his arms, and she let herself be held, let herself feel the strength of him, let herself believe for just a moment that maybe they could survive this. They stood like that in Margaret's bedroom, the afternoon light streaming through the windows, the city spread out below them, two broken people finding solace in each other's arms. Margaret watched them with quiet satisfaction, understanding that she had set something in motion that might finally break Victoria's hold on her grandson. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma and Alexander saw each other every day. He would visit his grandmother in the afternoons, and Emma would still be there, reading or talking with Margaret. They'd steal moments together, conversations in the hallway, walks in Central Park, phone calls late at night when Alexander couldn't sleep. Their connection deepened with each interaction. They talked about the accident that had connected their families in ways neither of them could have imagined. They talked about guilt and survival and the way trauma could either destroy you or transform you into something stronger. One evening, they stood on Margaret's terrace, looking at the city lights spreading out below them. The night was cold and Emma was shaking, so Alexander wrapped his arm around her shoulders.
"I love you," he said, and the words hung in the air between them like a promise. "I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other. But when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be alive." "I love you too," Emma said, and meaning it felt like stepping off a cliff and discovering that you could fly. It felt like being seen for the first time in 5 years. It felt like coming home. But on the 21st day, the thing they'd been dreading finally arrived. Emma was at her apartment, preparing to head to Margaret's, when there was a knock on the door. She opened it to find a man in an expensive suit, his expression serious and official. "Emma Mitchell?" he asked. "Yes." "I'm Detective James Harrison. I need to ask you some questions about an incident that occurred at Victoria Whitmore's residence. A valuable diamond bracelet went missing from her apartment. Mrs. Whitmore has filed a formal complaint and identified you as a suspect." Emma's stomach dropped like a stone into dark water. This was it. This was the moment Victoria had been preparing for, the blow that was meant to destroy her completely. "I've never been to her apartment. I've never stolen anything." "That may be, but I'm going to need you to come down to the station and give a formal statement." The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Emma sat in a small room with gray walls and fluorescent lights that hummed incessantly. She answered the same questions over and over, each time with the same answers. How had she met Alexander? How long had she known him? Had she ever been to Victoria's apartment? Did she know anything about a diamond bracelet? Had she taken anything from the Whitmore residence? She told the detective everything. How she'd met Alexander at the restaurant, how Victoria had humiliated her, how she'd been fired, how she'd taken the job with Margaret. She denied ever being in Victoria's apartment. She denied knowing anything about any bracelet. She denied taking anything.
But the detective's expression was skeptical. She could see it in his face. He didn't believe her. Or rather, he believed Victoria more than he believed her. "We have a witness," he said finally, after 6 hours of the same questions in different orders. "A member of the household staff. He says he saw you enter Mrs. Whitmore's bedroom around 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. He says he saw you near her jewelry box." "That's impossible," Emma said. "I was with Margaret on Tuesday afternoon. We were reading together the entire time." "That's convenient," the detective said. "But the witness is very credible. He works for the Whitmores. He has no motive to lie." Emma felt the trap snapping shut around her, felt the jaws of it closing, felt herself being crushed by the weight of Victoria's power. When Alexander found out about the accusation, he was furious in a way Emma had never seen before. His entire body was tense with rage. He went directly to his mother's apartment and confronted her. Emma heard about it later from Margaret, who had sources within the family and the social circles. He told her that if she didn't recant the accusation immediately, he would cut her out of his life completely, Margaret said. They were sitting in the living room, tea growing cold on the table between them. He told her that he wasn't going to choose between her and you. He told her that he was finally done letting her control him. "What did Victoria say?" Emma asked, her voice small and frightened. "She laughed," Margaret said, her expression grim. "She told him he was being foolish. She told him he'd come crawling back like he always does. And then Alexander left. He said he was moving out. He said he was staying at a hotel until this was resolved." The trial was set for 3 months later. In the interim, Alexander hired the best defense attorneys in New York. The legal fees were astronomical, hundreds of thousands of dollars, but Alexander barely blinked at the bills. He was determined to prove that his mother was lying and that Emma was innocent. Margaret continued to collect evidence. She had her private investigator document every move Victoria made, every transfer of money, every suspicious activity. She hired lawyers to review financial records going back years.
She spoke with former employees of the Whitmore household who had their own stories about Victoria's cruelty and manipulation, about how she destroyed people who threatened her control over Alexander. Emma continued to work for Margaret, and every day felt like living on borrowed time. She studied for the trial. She gave testimony to the defense attorneys. She tried not to think about the possibility of going to prison for a crime she didn't commit. The media got wind of the story. Gossip columnists speculated about the romance between the billionaire and the waitress accused of theft. Online forums debated whether Emma was a gold digger or a victim. Emma's name was everywhere, always connected to scandal, always connected to the accusation. Social media attacks came swift and vicious. People Emma had never met expressed their opinions about her character, her morality, her motives. Someone posted her address online. Someone else created a fake profile pretending to be her, posting things that would destroy her reputation. The internet, that great amplifier of human cruelty, found her and decided she was guilty. But Alexander didn't waver. Every single day, he showed up. Every single day, he held her hand and told her they would win. Every single day, he chose her over his own mother. Every single day, he proved that his love was stronger than his family's power. 3 weeks before the trial, Alexander appeared at Margaret's apartment with documents. His face was grim but victorious. Margaret invited Emma to join them, and Alexander spread papers across the coffee table like he was laying out a map of a battlefield he'd just conquered. "We have proof," he said, and his voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd finally caught his enemy in a trap of her own making. "Proof that my mother paid off the witness. Proof that she fabricated the entire accusation. Proof of her pattern of destroying people who get too close to me." The documents were damning. Financial records showing a transfer of $20,000 from Victoria's private account to the household staff member's bank account made the day after Emma had been blamed for the spilled drinks. Emails discussing the arrangement in barely coded language. Recordings of Victoria bragging to a friend about how she was removing the threat to Alexander. "What does this mean?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. "It means we're going to bury her," Alexander said, and there was something cold in his voice that Emma had never heard before. "Legally, publicly, completely. She's going to face charges for fraud and witness tampering, and when this is over, she's going to lose everything." The trial lasted 5 days. Emma had to sit in a courtroom watching Victoria present herself as a concerned mother worried about her son being manipulated by a gold digger. She had to listen to Victoria describe how Emma had befriended her, how Emma had deliberately targeted Alexander, and how Emma had stolen from her as a cruel act of revenge. But on the 5th day, Alexander's defense team presented the evidence Margaret had spent years collecting. Recordings of Victoria bragging about removing the threat to Alexander, financial documents showing payments to the witness, testimony from multiple former employees who'd been destroyed by Victoria's manipulation over the years, a housekeeper who'd been fired for refusing to lie, a chef who'd been blacklisted, a woman who'd been forced to sign an NDA to keep quiet about the abuse she had suffered. A pattern of behavior so consistent, so systematic, that it became impossible to deny. The prosecution tried to object. They tried to discredit the evidence. They tried to paint Margaret as a senile old woman with an axe to grind. But it was overwhelming. The jury's skepticism shifted from Emma to Victoria. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Not guilty on all counts. Emma collapsed in her chair, sobbing with relief. Alexander was at her side immediately, holding her as tears streamed down both their faces. The courtroom erupted in a buzz of whispers. Journalists scribbled notes. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, her perfect composure finally shattered. She was so sure she would win. She was so sure that her power and connections would be enough to destroy this girl who'd gotten too close to her son. She was wrong. After the trial, Victoria attempted suicide.
She took an overdose of her prescription sleeping pills in her apartment, trying to end the pain of her own destruction. She was found by her housekeeper 12 hours later, her body already cold but still alive. She was rushed to the hospital, her stomach pumped, her life saved against her will. She spent 2 weeks in a psychiatric hospital undergoing evaluation. During that time, she finally understood what she had done, the relationship she had destroyed, the people she had hurt, the son she had nearly lost completely.
When she was released, she was a different woman. Her hair was unkempt. Her clothes didn't fit properly. She'd lost weight and the will to maintain the facade that had defined her entire life. She looked like a ghost of the Victoria Whitmore who'd humiliated Emma in a restaurant, who'd orchestrated her firing, who'd falsely accused her of theft. She called Alexander from a small hotel apartment in Brooklyn. "I want to see you," Victoria said, her voice hollow and unrecognizable. They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Midtown. Victoria looked smaller than Emma had ever seen her, diminished by the weight of her own cruelty and the consequences that had finally caught up with her. "I'm sorry," Victoria said. She wasn't looking at Emma. She was looking at her son. "I spent so long trying to control you that I forgot how to love you. I was so afraid of losing you that I drove everyone away who might have made you happy." "Yes," Alexander said quietly. His voice wasn't angry. It was just sad. "You did." "I want to change," Victoria said. "I'm going to therapy. I'm going to try to be better. But I understand if you don't want me in your life anymore." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. The pain on his face was visible, the struggle of loving someone who had hurt you so deeply, who had nearly destroyed the person you loved most. "I don't know if we can have a relationship right now," he finally said. "But if you're serious about changing, about getting real help, then maybe someday we can try. For now, stay away from Emma, stay away from my life, and prove that you mean what you're saying." Victoria looked at Emma for the first time. Their eyes met across the small table, and Emma saw something in Victoria's expression that surprised her. Not manipulation, not calculation, just genuine remorse. "I'm sorry," Victoria said to Emma. "For all of it. For what I said to you at the restaurant. For trying to destroy you. For everything." Emma nodded, but she didn't forgive. Some things took time. 6 months after the trial, Emma enrolled at NYU to finish her degree in music therapy. She'd always wanted to help people heal through music, and now she had the chance to make that dream real. Her classes took up her afternoons, her work with Margaret continued in the mornings, and her relationship with Alexander deepened with each passing day. Daniel's physical therapy was reinstated, funded through Alexander's Foundation for Accident Survivors. The apartment was paid for a year in advance. Emma's life, which had been in free fall, finally had solid ground beneath it. Alexander stepped back from the daily operations of his company. He promoted a trusted executive to CEO and focused instead on the foundation work and on building a life with Emma that wasn't haunted by his mother's control or the ghosts of the past. They traveled together to the Caribbean islands where they could walk on beaches and feel the sun on their skin and taste salt water and sand, to Europe, where they could stand in front of paintings in museums and remember that beauty existed in the world, to places where no one knew their story, and they could just exist as two people in love, not as characters in a tragedy. On a cold December evening, exactly 1 year after the trial ended, Alexander took Emma back to Le Ciel Doré. The restaurant had been renovated since Emma's firing. New lighting, new linens, new energy. But it was still the same place where Emma had spilled drinks and been humiliated. The same place where Alexander had first seen her and recognized something true beneath the grief. They sat at the table near the window where they'd first sat together. Alexander pulled a small box from his pocket, and Emma's breath caught. "Emma," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I know our story isn't simple. I know we met through tragedy and pain and family cruelty. But you've made me realize that those things don't define us. We define ourselves by what we choose to do with the pain. And I choose you. Every day, for the rest of my life, I choose you." He opened the box to reveal a simple diamond ring. "Will you marry me?" Emma was crying before she could answer. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll marry you." The restaurant staff broke into applause. Marcus, who still worked there, was openly weeping. The other diners smiled and congratulated them. Some had been present on that fateful Friday night when the water was spilled, and everything changed. As snow began to fall outside the window, Emma and Alexander kissed, and it felt like every moment of pain and struggle had led to this moment of perfect, impossible joy.